The FBI is just releasing printed transcripts of Mateen's 911 calls from that night. My colleague, NBC's Justice correspondent Pete Williams, is joining me now. Pete, what more are we learning from these transcripts?
Quite a bit, Thomas. It turns out that the police negotiators talked to Omar Mateen for a total of 28 minutes. Now, we don't frankly learn a lot in the back and forth of the transcript of his 911 call that we didn't already know. He pledged support for ISIS. He identified himself in these calls with the negotiator. This is new material. As an Islamic soldier, he told the negotiator to tell America to stop bombing Syria and Iraq, and, quote, that's why he was here now. But here's a couple of new things. He says there is a vehicle outside that has some bombs, just to let you know, you people are going to get it, and I'm going to ignite it if they try to do anything stupid. Now, the police say they immediately checked out that van and didn't find any explosives. Later in the call, he said that he had a vest and described it, quote, as the kind they use in France. So this explains why the police thought that there might be explosives inside. While this is going on, about 4:21, the police say they pulled an air conditioner unit out of the wall in a dressing room. That got some more victims out. They say as some of the victims came out from the Pulse nightclub, they told the police that Mateen said he was going to put 4 vests with bombs on victims within 15 minutes. A couple of other new details that come from this information here, Thomas. The FBI says based on their analysis of the Orlando police radio communications, there were no reports of shots fired inside the Pulse nightclub between the initial exchange of gunfire that happened just after 2 a.m. and the time that responding officers arrived and then the final breach. So they say while he was in there in the restroom, there were no further reports of shots fired. In terms of the 911 call, the FBI director a week ago had given us pretty much this information. He called with the 911 operator 3 times. He gave his he said he didn't give his name. He said, my name is, I pledge allegiance to, and in the transcript here it's omitted, but we know that he pledged allegiance to al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS. He said it again, and may God protect him. In Arabic, he said, on behalf of, and then that's omitted in the transcript. So the main thing we learn here is new detail on what the police had heard from Mateen and survivors of the nightclub shooting about whether or not there were explosives. He said they were in the van. As people came out, they said that he was going to put explosive vests on 4 of the survivors and that he was wearing one himself. And of course, just to emphasize here, authorities have told us repeatedly that they never found any explosives either in the van or inside the nightclub, that he was not wearing an explosive vest. And this interesting detail about pulling the air conditioner unit out to get some of the people, Thomas.
And Pete, we're learning that it was exactly 3 hours from the moment the first call came in of shots being fired at the Pulse nightclub to 5:02 a.m. when the SWAT and hazardous device team formally entered that nightclub, breaking down the walls to try to rescue any survivors they could find inside. We're learning about a total of 3 calls, as you were help explaining, negotiation calls that took place, one 9 minutes long, another 16 minutes long, the third one approximately 3 minutes long. As this detail communicated to us now from the FBI, it says the shooter hung up and multiple attempts to get in touch with him, Omar Mateen, were unsuccessful. The news conference in Orlando is starting right now. Let's take you there and listen.
Partial transcripts of calls the shooter, Omar Mateen, had with 911 operators as well as with crisis negotiators with the Orlando Police Department. As the Attorney General announced yesterday, these are partial transcripts. Redactions have been made to avoid re-victimizing those who were in the Pulse nightclub during the early morning hours of June 12th. We wanted to release the transcripts at this time so that the public would have a better idea of the timeline during the morning hours of June 12th, and also so that you would have a better idea of what the law enforcement officers on the ground were dealing with when they made the decision to enter the nightclub. The brave men and women of the Orlando Police Department, the Orange County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and others should not be second-guessed. They performed valiantly during those early morning hours. Lives were saved because of their heroic work. I'd like to say that today there will be no questions answered regarding the investigation. It's been 1 week since the shooting. As you all know, this is a very thorough and comprehensive investigation of the largest mass shooting we've had, the most significant terrorist act since 9/11. No stone is being left unturned. I know that you're impatient for more information. It will be forthcoming in due course. But today, again, no questions about the investigation. Today, there will be no questions answered about the investigation. We're focusing only on the timeline of what occurred during the early morning hours of June 12th. Tomorrow, the Attorney General is going to be in Orlando. She's going to be briefed on the ground by me, the others at the U.S. Attorney's Office, by the FBI. She's going to have a chance to speak to the victims, and it's my understanding that unless things change, she will be speaking to the press tomorrow afternoon. You'll have a chance to ask her questions then. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague at the FBI, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Ron Hopper, and he can give you more details. Thank you.
Thank you, United States Attorney Bentley. Good morning. My name's Ron Hopper, and I'm the Assistant Special Agent in charge of the FBI here in Orlando, also in charge of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is conducting this current investigation. This investigation is 1 week and 1 day old, and it may last months and even years. But I want you to know that we will endeavor to bring justice to the victims who survived, as well as the family of the deceased who were so viciously murdered. As many of us celebrated Father's Day this past weekend, several were reminded of their lost one and the tragic events that happened on June 12th. Before I provide an update in the investigation, I'd like to acknowledge my partners that are here with me today. I'd like to recognize Chief John Mina with the Orlando Police Department, who will provide remarks following my comments. Orange County Sheriff Jerry Demings, Florida Department of Law Enforcement SAC Danny Banks, DEA Assistant Special Agent in Charge Jeff Walsh, ATF Trevor Velnor, Mayor of Orlando Buddy Dyer, Mayor of Orange County Teresa Jacobs, and additional partners including the Florida Highway Patrol, Orange County Fire Department, Orlando Fire Department, and many other partners who assisted us in this difficult investigation. The Joint Terrorism Task Force has released excerpts and portions of the timeline of events that happened inside the club of the Pulse on June 12th. You've been provided with a general timeline of the Orlando Police Department's radio communications, as well as a 50-second conversation between the killer and the Orlando police dispatcher. While we're not releasing the audio, what I can tell you is that while the killer made these murderous statements, he did so in a chilling, calm, and deliberate manner. Finally, a summary of the communications between the crisis negotiator and the shooter have been provided to you, and the chief will take your comments and questions after my formal remarks. While we will not be providing the 911 calls made by the victims, we're doing this out of ultimate respect. Yes, the audio is compelling, but to expose that now would be excruciatingly painful to exploit them in this way. This is an active investigation. It remains an active investigation, and while we understand your interest, we appreciate your patience as we find the facts methodically and carefully. As you will see from the transcripts that we provided just a few moments ago, the killer of 49 and the shooter of 53 others identified himself as an Islamic soldier who pledged allegiance to a terrorist organization which was bent on killing Americans. He does not represent the religion of Islam, but a perverted view which, based on what we know today, was inspired by extremist killers. We currently have no evidence that he was directed by a foreign terrorist group, but was radicalized domestically. As you can see from the information we provided just a few moments ago, the killer stated that he had an explosive device, but none was found. I also want to point out the heroic actions of not only the first responders, but the victims who were inside the club that morning. They were under the most inconceivable stress, and they bravely assisted law enforcement in bringing it to a resolution. There's no doubt that their actions saved lives. Our investigation into the motives behind the killer and anyone who may have conspired with him or supported him continues. Please also keep in mind that the investigation of the shooting exchange between police and the killer is ongoing. I would point out that some have mistakenly rushed to judgment regarding the actions of these brave men and women. What they did that evening and those early morning hours was nothing less than extraordinary. To give you an idea of the scope of the investigation to date, I want to provide you with a few facts. The Joint Terrorism Task Force has conducted over 500 interviews as we sit here today. 117 vehicles were released to owners and registrants of family members of the victims who were at the Pulse nightclub, and we have approximately 10 left to return. More than 600 pieces of evidence were obtained and processed from the crime scene. We've received thousands of tips based on our appeal to the public, and we ask that you continue to call us at 1-800-CALL-FBI or visit FBI.gov. In closing, I want to advise that we're nearing the conclusion of our processing of the crime scene here outside the Pulse nightclub, and that we hope to restore the area and the outside perimeter to the community within the early part of this week. I want to point out special and extraordinary devotion to the effort here by the Christ Church of Orlando, the Salvation Army, and countless businesses in the Orlando area that have supported law enforcement and our efforts tremendously as their way of paying respect to the victims of this horrendous act. I'd also like to recognize the tremendous efforts of the FBI's evidence response team, who spent the last week processing the most devastating crime scene under circumstances that were very difficult. It's a life-changing experience for all of us, and they've done their duty quietly and among the most noble law enforcement professionals. As I mentioned earlier, this area is expected to be restored to relative normal business early this week, and we do not expect to hold any further press conferences from this location. Thank you. I'd now like to turn it over to Chief John Mina.
Thanks, Ron. Good morning. First, I want to say we appreciate the incredible patience that our community has. We know there are many questions, and people want to know what happened that night. The timeline released based upon radio communications clearly shows our officers were within the club within minutes and engaged the suspect in gunfire. And that's important because that engagement and that initial entry caused him to retreat, stop shooting, and barricade himself in the bathroom with hostages. So it's important to note that this started as an active shooter situation. Our officers took action and then transitioned into a barricade gunman hostage situation. So after that second exchange of gunfire, upon that initial entry of our officers, there was no other gunfire until the hostage rescue operation took place. So during that 3 hours, I just want to make sure everyone's clear on that, there was no gunfire. So during that time, our officers were intermittently in and out of that club, saving people, rescuing people from inside the club. That's another misconception. We were inside the club along with our fellow agency partners. And at some point during, if you see on the timeline, our officers were able to push an air conditioning through to one of the dressing rooms, and I believe saved 8 people out of that room. So I'm extremely proud of the heroic actions of our officers, and I am very confident they saved many, many, many lives that night. We continue to concentrate on the security of the crime scene, and eventually we'll open up roadways and businesses, but we ask that people please be patient with us on that. We're also concentrating on the many vigils and events and providing security for everyone and making sure everyone feels safe as well. And also our top priority at the City of Orlando is making sure our residents are safe and the reduction of crime. Again, I want to thank everyone for their patience as we go through this process, and I also want to thank the community for the huge outpouring of support for our local law enforcement who did a tremendous job in this situation. I'm going to turn it over to Orange County Sheriff Jerry Demings at this time.
Thank you, Chief. Good morning. You now heard about the timeline of events during the early morning hours of June the 12th. As you've heard, that this has been a collaborative effort from the very beginning. I must say that the response of the Orlando Police Department and those initial responding law enforcement officers has been nothing less than short of being extraordinary. One of the reasons why the response was extraordinary is really because of the overall preparedness to deal with an incident like this. Prior to this crisis, our federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies have been preparing for this event. In fact, for years now, we have prepared to respond to a terror event. In recent months, our agencies have been involved in training our personnel to be able to rapidly respond to an active shooter incident. In terms of our overall preparedness, I want to talk a little bit about our partnership with the Department of Homeland Security. In September of 2014, in fact, on September the 9th and September the 10th, we participated in a joint counterterrorism exercise that was held here in Orlando at the Orange County Convention Center. That exercise was designed to prepare us to respond to an active shooter situation involving mass casualties. On October the 28th of 2014, Department of Homeland Security Undersecretary General Francis Taylor visited our Central Florida Intelligence Exchange, which we refer to as our Fusion Center here locally. This is a tremendous asset to our region because our Fusion Center, the Central Florida Intelligence Exchange, has our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners who work daily regarding counterterrorism efforts in this community. During the events of June the 12th, the CFIX activated and was successful in disseminating substantial information to our law enforcement partners here within our region as well as across our nation. The Fusion Center has continued to be and play a vital role in the effort since that time. They have been involved in providing daily updates and situation reports to law enforcement partners. They've also provided daily counterterrorism reports and working with the FBI in this investigation. Their efforts will continue on a day-to-day basis. I will share with you that in this community, the citizens who live here should be confident by knowing that you have competent law enforcement authorities who are able to respond rapidly to any situation that we will be confronted with in the future. However, there are daily efforts to prevent a similar attack from occurring. That will be based solely on the collaboration between, again, our federal, state, and local law enforcement authorities. Let me move on now and talk just briefly about the first responders. Chief Mina mentioned the heroic acts of those first responders. We want to make certain that at this point, we do take care of our personnel, because on that day, they saw some very horrific things, and our goal is moving forward to ensure that they are provided with the diffusion as well as counseling sessions to ensure that to what extent we can minimize any PTSD type effects on them into the future. Again, I'm going to conclude by saying that our community remains a safe community, and we certainly support people coming in and visiting our community. It is a vibrant community, a resilient community, and much of what you have seen in the last few days and hours has been a reminder that this community is still here and willing and working together to make this a safe place for our families and our visitors here. Thank you so much.
Now we'll take questions.
Could you clarify something in the timeline? You say that there was no shooting after the gun was retrieved in the bathroom. People were dying in the bathroom.
There was no shooting for that 3-hour period until the commencement of the hostage rescue operation.
Special Hopper, at 4:29 a.m. you said that you learned that several witnesses that said that the gunman threatened to put several explosives to death within 50 minutes. The decision to change was not made. Why? What happened during that time?
Well, during that time, we were ensuring that our explosive entry team had set the charge and everyone was ready for an explosive entry, so that does take time.
Special Agent Hopper, at your last update, you asked the public for help trying to figure out the most complete picture of the shooter and why he did it. These transcripts show he told you why he did it. He did it for the Islamic State. What good does it do redacting all mentions to ISIS?
Part of the redacting is meant to not give credence to individuals who have done terrorist acts in the past. We're not going to propagate their rhetoric, their violent rhetoric, and we see no value in putting those individuals' names back out there. We're trying to prevent future acts from happening again, and for cowards like this one, people like that influence them, so we're not going to continue to put their names out front.
Does the FBI redact a lot of redact things from transcripts in any investigations?
I'm not familiar with the other investigations you may be referring to, but for this one, we think it's highly important.
Outside the 3 hours, there were shots fired at 2:08, exchange between the shooter and the police officers that responded, and then there were shots fired at 5:14 after the breach of the wall. During those two instances of gunfire, were there any casualties?
Repeat your question.
Outside of the 3 hours where there was no gunfire in the club, at 2:04, when there was initial exchange for the backup officers inside the club, and at 5:14 after the breach of the wall, the final gunfire that killed the shooter, were there any casualties that resulted from that gunfire besides the shooter?
That's all part of the investigation. All of that is being reconstructed at this time.
The tone you use is very defensive as to responding to criticism. Can you explain what is it that you're responding to exactly?
I don't understand what you're saying.
You all sound like you're responding to criticism of the response. You sound like there's something very specific that you're addressing. I'd like to know what that is.
Oh, absolutely. We received many comments from the press and from the public, some emails about, I think there was this misconception that we didn't do anything for 3 hours, and I'm just trying to clarify that's absolutely not true. Our officers were in the club within minutes, exchanged gunfire with the suspect, forced him to stop shooting and retreat into the bathroom. From there, we let our negotiator take over and try and negotiate this to a peaceful resolution in an effort to save lives while our SWAT team set up. So that's the issue for the clarification.
Was there any actual negotiations with the gunman? Can you help us understand?
Was there what?
Were there any actual negotiations back and forth with the gunman?
Some of that was released this morning.
Yes. Some of that was released earlier. Yes, there was. Our negotiator was talking with him.
Chief, how likely is it that some of the victims may have been shot and killed by police gunfire in the initial attempt to save lives?
That's all part of the investigation, but here's what I will tell you. Those killings are on the suspect, and on the suspect alone, in my mind. All that will be investigated by our officers, acted heroically, and did as they were trained in an unbelievable circumstances, and did a phenomenal job.
How are you right now? Answer that question.
Okay. The question was, how difficult was it for me to make that decision? And I will tell you, just as the sheriff said, we have been training for this situation for many, many years, since Columbine, since 9/11. I knew our officers were ready. I knew our SWAT team members were ready. I knew our hospitals were ready. And yes, it's a very difficult decision to make, but it was the right decision at the right time, and I stand by that, and we make the same decision standing here today.
Mr. Hopper, other than setting the victim's 911 calls aside, the redactions obviously will invite controversy and questions. Why would you want to redact anything if it what came out of the shooter's mouth? Why not just let it speak for itself and then bring the analysis in on the back end?
So I've already addressed that question. We're not going to propagate violent rhetoric that comes from other people, whether they be here or overseas. And to do that would only inflame other people here that might be like-minded. So there's no purpose in doing that.
Does Florida law allow for that kind of exemption?
Other attacks on the Orlando area within the following days. At what point was law enforcement able to discredit those maybe coming attacks, and how were you guys able to handle the fear?
That's an excellent question. So immediately upon dealing with this situation, we had an intelligence component directed specifically at determining whether or not other threats existed to this area as well as throughout the United States nationally. I can't tell you that there's a specific finite time when we said, okay, everything is fine, the coast is clear. In fact, we continue to do that this day. That's the reason the Joint Terrorism Task Force exists, as well as the partnerships with our state and local partners and CFIX. We do that second by second, minute by minute, daily. And so we continue to do that.
Trying to keep people talking so that you can get into the club and save people? Your strategy in the negotiations, were you trying to keep them talking so you can get in and save people? Take us through those moments, those 3 hours.
Absolutely. Anytime we can engage a suspect who's in a hostage situation, we definitely want to keep them talking, not only to peacefully resolve the situation and cause less life to be lost, but also to set up and make sure our teams are ready to enter, yes.
My second part of my question was, how concerned, besides the explosive issue, obviously concerned, how much did the concern that you, whichever way possible, get past your officers, how much did that play into your strategy of how you proceeded so that you wasn't able to get past your officers?
There was never a concern that he was going to get away. We were going to take him into custody.
Do you have any evidence
You sent the call out at 2:20 for the
What's
SWAT
that?
team. You sent the call out for the SWAT team about 2:18 working for timeline. How soon was the SWAT team able to assemble there? Why didn't they go in before, say, around 3 o'clock, where it looks like on the timeline the gunman first mentioned anything about bombs?
Well, like I said, our SWAT team responded and set up for all situations, and part of that, I'm not going to go into all of our tactics, but I will say, it takes time to set up explosives and do an explosive entry. Those things take time.
You saying that calls with the witnesses that were inside the club during those 3 hours. Can you talk about some of the information that they may have given you, the officers, to help them?
Absolutely, those calls were very vital, and that's how we received the information about the explosives. So very vital to receive that information from people inside of the club.
Do you have evidence that the motive would have been anything other than radical Islamic terror? As you look through things about his life, people in his family, things that he was up to, do you have any reason to think that he could have gone in to attack for any reason other than acting as an Islamic fighter?
Yes, absolutely. We're actually looking into any potential motive. We're not limiting ourselves to coming up with just one motive. We're looking at a myriad of things right now, and that actually is ongoing as we speak, both through social media, friend contacts, people that had only met the individual for one time, and that's why we're asking for anybody and everybody that's had any contact with this individual to come forward so we can piece that information together for potential other motives as well.
Have you been able to corroborate any reports that he was gay, that the gunman was gay? 2 more questions.
Those allegations are still being vetted out as we speak, and there's no determination been made at this time.
Hey, two more questions. Actually happening. I wonder if your officers, when the actual shooting was happening, were able to access that video and watch the movements of the shooter inside the club.
And also, please answer the question.
No, I can't talk about any video. That's all part of the investigation.
Shannon,
do you have a question?
Can you talk about a possible fence in the back of that club that you thought may have been an escape route?
No, I can't talk about that at this time.
Okay, that's the last question.
Last question.
Last question.
The old clubs, he already told
Speaking
you.
with several witnesses at the club, we know that the shooter spoke for these witnesses with several other people on the phone besides the police dispatcher, besides your hostage negotiator. Who else did
We can't comment on that. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a news conference from Orlando as we learn new information about the terror attack that now took place 8 days ago. The FBI and the police chief there in Orlando, John Mina, answering questions from reporters, among other things, as they detail this timeline and some of the 911 calls that took place over the course of that day where the shooter was communicating directly with investigators. They now tell us that the shooter identified himself to 911 officials, saying, "I did the shooting," that his calls and in the conversation he maintained a chilling, calm, and deliberate manner, identifying himself as an Islamic soldier who pledged allegiance to ISIS. Again, our justice correspondent Pete Williams has been listening along with me right now. And Pete, walk us through some of the new information that we've learned here about this timeline of events and what some people have raised as questions about that 3-hour window where really no shots were fired. Today, law enforcement officials making it clear that that doesn't mean they were sitting on their heels. In fact, they were executing their plan as best they could under stressful circumstances.
Peter, that's the essence of today's news. We knew about the 911 calls. We see the actual words, but we don't learn anything there. It's the timeline and what police say they were doing. So let's walk it through real quickly. The first reports of shots fired at 2:02. At 2:04, more police officers arrive. They enter the nightclub at 2:08. There's a full call out for SWAT at 2:18. And then after that, they say, after that initial shooting, no more shots are fired until they finally breach and punch a hole in the wall. He calls 911, the first call at 2:35. Then there are a total of 28 minutes worth of discussions with the crisis negotiators that go on at 2:48, 3:03, and 3:24. This is a new detail. At 4:21, police inside the club pull out an air conditioner and allow more victims to escape. At 4:29, some of the victims tell the police that Martin said he was going to put 4 explosive vests on victims within 15 minutes. And we also learned that during one of these crisis negotiation calls, he had said that there were explosives in his van. They searched that, didn't find any, and also said he was wearing an explosive vest. He never was. Then at 5:02, they punch the hole in the wall and start to get people out. And at 5:15, 1 minute later, they shoot him and he is dead. So that's the news here.
Yeah.
The other thing is the Justice Department of the FBI made a decision not to use the actual words in the transcripts that they've released, where he, as we've heard before, praises al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, talks about ISIS. This has generated some questions, but what they're basically saying is, this is a guy that killed 49 people, injured 50 plus more. Why should we amplify his propaganda?
Pete Williams reporting for us right there. And Pete, joining us now is MSNBC contributor and former executive assistant director of the FBI, Sean Henry. Sean, I'm glad you're here to help us right now. A lot of the scrutiny around this investigation is focused on this sort of 3-hour gap and whether more could have been done. Where do you see as the sort of, I guess they're not holes, but what the real source of the investigation is right now as they Monday morning quarterback and see what differently could have been done under extraordinary circumstances like they were in that Pulse nightclub 8 days ago?
Yeah, I don't see any holes with what I've seen with the timeline. Certainly there are a lot of questions. People want to know that they've lost loved ones and they want to understand exactly what happened and is there a way that their loved one could have been saved. Clearly this press conference was really about trying to answer those questions because there has been a lot of criticism. I think when the officers go in, there's the initial shots fired, and that he retreats, the killer retreats to another part of the club. This is what happens. You've got a dynamic entry, you've got shots fired, an active shooter, and then you've got no shots, and they've established some contact with him. Those tactical officers, their first priority is to save lives. That's what they do. They're trained for it. For years, they've been training against active shooters for years. I've worked with police agencies around the country. This is a key issue. Once they've got him holed up in that back room, their key is to try and get hostages released or to get him to give himself up. I think that a lot of what we're hearing about suicide vests, there might be a bomb. There's also the concern there might be other shooters that are somewhere in that club. Those officers are thinking very, very strategically. Let me be very, very clear. They're actively working for 3 hours. They're not sitting around waiting for something to happen. While the negotiators are talking to the killer, there's a tactical team that is preparing to do an entry into that building to rescue people. That is done simultaneously.
And Sean, to be very clear, I mean, you can speak to this better than anybody. When a shooter in a situation like this claims suicide vests on some of the victims inside that club, that a vehicle outside is loaded with explosives, a bomb, in fact, in this situation, they have to take that seriously. You can't afford to allow themselves to be wrong in that case if they don't take it seriously.
Absolutely right. You've got the lives of victims at risk as well as the lives of the officers. I think what's important to know is when they made that entry, ultimately, when they punched through that building using explosive breach, they had reason to believe that he was going to kill other people. They had felt, in my opinion, that they had gotten as far as they could with the negotiation and that lives were at risk and they needed to go in at that very moment. Everything I've seen says that these officers did everything that they could do at the time with the information that they had. These people go into work every single day to try and protect citizens' lives. And I think while you absolutely need to look back to see if there are better lessons to be learned, for people to sit back and criticize them, I think that's a big mistake.
Well, and more than anything, it says more than we could possibly imagine about the mind of a killer in a situation like this, how unstable he was to perpetrate such a violent act like this. Sean Henry helping us out, and my colleague Pete Williams as well. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. And coming up right here live on MSN.